Hello everyone, my name is Jessie February and I'll be bringing you the recap for round 8. And thank you so much to our annotators Nijat Abasov and Ulvi Bajarani. In game 1, we had Richard Rapport versus Jan-Christoph Duda. The two candidates' first timers faced off today, hoping to climb back to an even score. It may be defeatist to look at things in these terms, but scoring 50% in your first candidates tournament against the best players in the world would be a nice result for these two. In a 4-nights game, Rapport lived up to his reputation by playing strangely in the opening with the somewhat strange g3 on move 4. And the marginally more strange b3 on move 8. They are slower, sort of strange, and a careful maneuvering game ensued. Duda couldn't find the best defending moves, and was eventually overrun on the king side. So let's take a look at the game between Richard Rapport and Jan-Christoph Duda. Starting off with what looks like the Petrov transposes to the 2 knights and with g3. After bishop c5, there was bishop g2, and Rapport avoids the fight over the center in favor of the fianchetto development. In the long-term game, black shouldn't have any problems here. And after d3, a5, preventing the trade of the dark squared bishops with knight c3 to a4, and then of course bishop a7 is now possible. So castles, h6, and b3. Quite interesting, preventing the blockage of the queen side with a5, a4, but in addition to that, also allowing the chance to fianchetto if need be here. So after castles, we have h3 and knight to d4, with the same idea explained with knight d4 variation. While white wants to attack on the king side, black wants to create the counterplay in the center and the queen side. So bishop to e3, c6, and king to h2, preparing the f2 to f4 break at some point, but it's a bit too slow. So rook e8 is a fantastic move in this position, and after a3, we have knight takes f3, queen takes f3, and bishop takes e3. And here Rapport decided to take with the f-pawn, and after b5, there was g4, rook a7, and black has captured the space on the queen side and has opened the 7th rank. In the following moves, white prepares an attack and black takes actions against it. And after queen to g3, h5. And h5 apparently wasn't as necessary, but after g5, h4. And Duda captures the g5 pawn, but opens up the g file. This increases the danger on his king. And Duda captures the g5 pawn, but it opens up the g file, and this increases the danger on his king. So h4, knight h7, bishop to h3, trading the worst bishop. Natural. After bishop takes h3, rook to g1, threatening mate in 1, and white plays an interesting intermediate move, giving black the question of the pawn structure. So white plays an interesting intermediate move, giving black the question of the pawn structure for the remainder of the game. And now it is the critical moment of the game because black's position degrades with every move. After this, so after knight to g5, pawn takes g5, and bishop back to c8. And Duda decides to close the g file, but the defense on the h file is more difficult for black since it's completely open. And rook to g2, rook a to e7. The idea is unfortunately blocking its pieces, and rather the counterintuitive f6 keeps the equality in the position. And in general, it's not recommended to play on the side that your opponent attacks, but black has enough strength to defend its king in this position, and white's king might also be vulnerable. So rook a to e7 and queen to f3. The logical move, but it allows black to survive if black finds the fantastic idea of f6 once again. So here, queen h4 would have been a little bit better. For example, rook e6, queen h5, rook g6, and rook f1. And white's plan is simple, combining rooks, doubling them on the f-file to capture the f7 pawn and attack the h-file. So after queen to f3, g6 happened and was considered a decisive mistake. As we mentioned, f6 idea still works here with takes and rook to f7. So after g6, rook to h1. Now it's almost impossible to defend the king for black, and white's attack develops itself after f5. There's king g1, b4, capturing on f5, and of course leaving the knight. Who even needs a knight when you have mate in mind? And after capturing, knight to e4. Very, very interesting. And here young Christoph Duda resigns. Game 2, we had Jan Nepomniachtchi versus Ding Liren. Sometimes grandmasters arrive at the board while not absolutely full to their eyeballs with desire to win the game. It doesn't necessarily come from laziness either. If you're ahead in the tournament by a reasonable margin, taking a quick draw or a longer but similarly easy draw is a perfectly reasonable strategy decision on its own merits, forgetting any human factors like the extra rest you'll be getting before the next game. This was one of those games. So let's take a look at the seemingly quick game. We have e4, e5, knight to f3, knight to c6, and we see the two knights in this game as well after d4 instead of g3 here. Knight takes on d4 and bishop to b4. Knight takes on c6, bishop to d3 and d5, trading off, and black castles. White also castles and black recaptures on d5 with queen to f3, c6 and bishop to g5. I remember seeing this game and thinking at what moment did the players decide that this was going to be a draw. So let's take a look. Rook a to e1, rook to b8 and knight to d1. h6, capturing on f6, queen takes and queen takes. And then we have b3, f5 and knight to e3. f4, just trying to get rid of this very weak double pawn, and knight to f5, bishop takes, and king to g7, trying to get the rook over, g3, and king to f6. Very strong move. Bishop to d3, and now we can see clearly that they have the opposite color bishops as well. Rook to h8 and king to f3. Black finally gets rid of these double pawns and captures on g3, h takes. Now we have both rooks on the h file, and after captures a5, a4, bishop to b4, just lodging the bishop over there, not allowing any pawn movements, and after rook f1, capturing the rook, so we have a rook trade and one rook each. There goes the second pair of rooks, and f5, king e2, bishop to c3, bishop to b4, and we have repetition by move 37. And as I said, a seemingly short game. Game 3, we had Hikaru Nakamura play Fabiano Caruana. The two Americans played each other today in what was a critical game for both of them. Coming into the round, Caruana was half a point behind the leader and Nakamura a full point behind that. The opening was a fashionable and unbalanced line in the Rilo pairs. With white trading a piece for 2 pawns and central control, Caruana seemed to have gained equality when he lost the plot a bit with move 22, c4, and especially move 27, knight to c5, and Nakamura was suddenly winning. Caruana lost one of his critical central pawns and the other was firmly blockaded on the dark squares. Unable to find any counterplay against superior firepower, Caruana resigned on move 74. This game came as a shocker to all of us. We were biting our nails, we were eating our popcorn, we were running around in circles trying to understand what was going on in this game. I can definitely remember having my eyes glued to the TV, watching this on a live broadcast. Honestly, I could not have asked for more action. And why was it nail-biting? First of all, we have two Americans playing one another. Second of all, Fabiano was only half a point behind the leader Nepo. And honestly, perhaps we do want someone sitting across from Magnus a year from now. So let's take a look at the game. So we have the Rilo pairs, bishop e5, knight f6 and capturing on e4, d4, b5 and bishop to b3. And after d5 taking on e5, and we still have theory, knight to d2 castles, bishop c2, capturing on c2. And after bishop takes, king takes, f6 and knight to f1. The new fashion to fight against the bishop c5 variation. And after capturing on e5, we have king to g1 and queen to d6. Bishop e3, bishop f5, bishop e3, and rook a to d8. So queen e1 is one of the main ideas of this position, to move the queen to the f2 square and to capture the d4 and c5 squares. So basically to control d4 and c5. And after knight to a5, we have queen f2 and knight to b7. Knight b7, defending the c5 square and avoiding this attack over here. And after rook e1, continuing the pressure in the center, Caruana plays c5. After knight to g3, we have bishop to d3. And bishop g6 is also possible here. After bishop to d3, queen to d2, and once again, c4. Pushing the wrong pawn, although it is not trivial to understand. So the future knight on c5 wouldn't be as well placed as it seems. e4, however, keeps the equality of the position. So after c4, there is bishop to d1 and rook to d7. Moving the rook to the f file since it's impossible to push the d5 to d4. Bishop to f2, rook d to f7, and knight to h1, defending the bishop on the f2 square and freeing the g3 square. So this move defends both the bishop on f2, so knight h1 protects the f2 bishop and also prepares a possible bishop to g3. Now after e4, here, knight d4 and queen to g6. And here starts the thunder. h4, the best and the trickiest move. After knight to c5, Caruana doesn't feel the strength of white's threat. In the next moves, it will be made clear. h5. Now, the idea is clearly seen, and black's queen is pushed away, leaving the g4 square completely defenseless. White's bishop, after the activation of white's light pieces, black is seemingly lost. Except the slight inaccuracies, Nakamura's technique is commendable. After queen to d6, bishop to g4, activating the bishop, and after h6, queen to e3, threatening knight to f5. And after queen f4, queen takes, rook takes, knight to e6. Knight takes, bishop takes check, and king h7. After munching the pawn on d5, there's rook f5 and bishop c6, taking the pawn back on h5 and bishop d5. After the rooks double up once again, knight to f2, rook f7, and b4. Whoever says no to en passant? Well, Fabi does. h5 and a4. After capturing bishop takes and h4, bishop to e3 and rook to f5, rook a1, h3, and rook to a2, defending the knight. Of course, after knight takes h3, it doesn't work due to rook takes, and king to h2. Rook a2, taking on g2, and bishop to d1, defending the f3 square to prevent rook f5 to f3 here, and rook to f6, bishop to g4, rook to d5, king captures on g2. Now everything is ready to activate the king. White makes its pieces better in the following moves, as we see. So bishop d5, just moving the king closer, and the knight repositioning the pieces in the way where they work well, really well together. And bishop f2 just stops the pawn from queening, and after check, king to f4 and king to g3 here, just going after the pawn. And after knight to e3, we have rook to f6 check. And this was seemingly a mistake. Black missed the last chance to create some obstacles here with rook h1, knight g2, and g4. So after rook f6, there was king to g3 and rook to f1. Now white has no difficulties converting this endgame, and after getting the knight as a blockade, rook to e5, king to f6, and it's over after knight to f3. Big game for Hikaru Nakamura. Congratulations. In Game 4, we had Alireza Firouzja versus Timur Rajabov. Alireza entered this event with high hopes of a match with Magnus, but things haven't gone his way. He managed a slow Italian game for 74 moves, of which most positions were better for him. Our Grandmaster annotator got lots of practice using the white is better icon, but unfortunately, Alireza never had a reason to use anything more extreme. So we have the Italian, one of my favorite cuisines, with h3 and h6, c3 and d6, knight to d2, a6, b4 was played here, and after a4, bishop to e6, capturing on e6 castles, rook e1, queen e8, maneuvering the rook to a2, king h2, bishop e3, just capturing, bishop e3, trading off the bishops and knight to g4. After knight to e7, we have knight to g1, and preparing g2 to g3 just to push the knight back. After knight g to e6, knight c6 was also in the works over there. After knight e to g6, there's g3, knight h5, and king to g2. Thanks to the control of both the queen side and the center, white is better. Knight to f6 and knight to f3. White is not afraid of the trade since after knight takes g4, there's just h takes g4 opening up the g file for white. Queen d7 and knight f to h2. Queen c6 here with queen to b3, rook a to e8 and h4. We're seeing a common theme of this round with h4 shining quite brightly. The unnecessary push on the king side. Remember, in most cases, it's not better to play on the king side when you are not stronger than your opponent. So knight to h5 here and rook to e3. It is easy to lose the sense of danger when the position's characteristics don't change for a long time. Rook e3 blocks the e3 square, which might later cause problems for the g4 knight. And black found the right move here, b5. After knight to f3, queen to d7, b5, knight f3, queen d7, and the game is back to its usual pace. Queen to d1 and knight to f6, knight back to h2, attacking the c3 pawn now with the queen, and rook a3 defending it, king h7, king g1, and rook to f7. After capturing on b5, there's d4, doubling up the rooks on the f-file for black there, and queen to c4. After rook b2, we have rook a8 and rook to f3, rook back. And here we see the repetition of the moves once, just due to the fact that both were in time trouble approaching move 40. And after knight takes f6, changing the structure, g takes f6, knight f3, and knight e7. f5 might lead to the complex game with equal chances. f5 might lead to a complex game with equal chances here, but after knight e7, knight d2, now white has the pressure again. Queen c6, capturing on e5, and rook to f3, a brilliant move. Rook does not want to trade, goes to g7 instead, and king to h2, an unnecessary prophylaxis according to our annotator, and here queen to e8. Now white gets vulnerable due to the sacrifices on the h4 square. Queen b3, queen g6, and rook to a2. Apparently it allows white to reduce the danger with f2 to f3, which is played, and after queen g6, knight f1. So in the moves to come, after knight to f1, both sides maneuver their pieces to find the right moment to force a situation. White is better, but black has good chances to keep the position drawn. After queen f2, rook f8, and knight to d2, knight b3, and in this case after rook g8. And after the next few moves here, white tries to use the open file with a1, rook g7, knight to d2, and on move 58, white plays queen to e3. Not quite understanding black's idea. After knight to g8, moving the knight back to f6 square, knight f1, knight f6, queen e2, and after the next series of moves, we just find that pieces are maneuvering and the pawn structure does not change. And queen h5, king h3, which actually allows knight takes e4. King h8 is played instead, missing the chance to equalize here. And after knight to g4, queen to g6, knight takes, queen takes, and rook back to a1. Queen g6, g4, stopping the attack on the g3 square, and queen drops back to f7, queen e3, king h7, and rook to a5. And h5 apparently deserves more attention due to the fact that it closes the king side. Here we have queen to d7, queen d3, and c6. Rook a1, queen back to f7, and queen to e3. Queen f6. And now we find that the position is completely equal. Despite the structure only changing ever so slightly, the king makes its way forward, but regardless, the game then ends in a repetition. Thank you so much for watching the video and supporting the channel. Don't forget to give the video a like and subscribe if you haven't already. It's always a pleasure working with the team. Without them, this would not be possible. I'll see you tomorrow.